Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. I'm here with the one and only Dr. Richard Wolff. Dr. Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University, NYC. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update, which we carry as well at KPFT 90.1 FM Houston. His latest book is The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, and is available along with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at www.democracyatwork.info, and as well, the books are at our site, politicsdoneright.com. Dr. Wolff, how are you doing today?
Very, very well, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely, sir. Well, I mean, I'm going to ask the silly question first. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it for many reasons, one of which is very simple. Millions of people in the United States and beyond are asking themselves, what in the world is going on? The world is topsy-turvy. We can't go outside. We have to shelter. We can't get 6 feet from one another. Our jobs are in jeopardy, if not gone. Our incomes are in jeopardy, if not gone. The rich are getting even richer as the mass of people have a problem. What in the world is happening? The second reason I wrote the book is because an awful lot of people seem to think that the basic problem is a virus. And I wanted to write a book that said, no, 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 viruses are a part of nature. They've been with the human race from day one, thousands of years. We know what a virus is. We know how it works. We know how it is dangerous. The only question is whether a society is prepared and able to deal with it or not. Ours proved to be incapable. And I wanted to show people that that is a problem of the system we live with, not of the virus that periodically comes and bothers us. That's why we call the book, the system is the sickness. The sickness is the system. Don't be distracted by the fact that, yes, we have a pandemic and it's serious, but that's not our basic problem. We know how to deal with pandemics, difficult as it is. What we are not yet willing to face, and why I wrote the book, is that we have an economic system that is more dangerous to us than any virus, and we have to finally face it, understand it, and change it.
Now, Dr. Wolff, what's interesting is the very first part of your book, part 1, says capitalism crashes again. COVID-19 was just a trigger. I tell you something, I became aware of all your work back in, I think it was 2008 or a little thereafter, after the crash that we had. I think you came out with a program called Capitalism Hits the Fan.
Right.
I can say that I became a disciple then, because there was a magical chart that you showed in that particular video. And that chart showed when extreme capitalism took over, where productivity was going skyrocket, and our baseline salaries remained the same, and the difference in still having the power to purchase was based on them giving us credit, which again was giving away the store. Right. And when I saw that, I went ahead and I put your stuff all over the place. This is what's happening to America. But this is a bit deeper now, because now I always remember when you said capitalism hit the fan. Yes, it hit the fan, but it's still going. Well, it has really hit the fan now. And you title the first chapter is COVID-19 was just the trigger. Tell me, please, what exactly are there's a building blocks of failure. Give me the building blocks of failure as you see that COVID toppled.
Okay, let's go through it step by step. First of all, your important point Capitalism crashes throughout its history, 300 years of history since it started back in England. Wherever capitalism settles in, on the average, every 4 to 7 years, it crashes. Sometimes the crashes don't last very long and they don't cut very deep. Other times, they last a very long time and they cut very deep. They throw millions of people out of work, they collapse millions of businesses, and it's a disaster. Capitalism has tried through its 300 years everything it can think of to stop this, because they understood, particularly the capitalists, the big businesses, that this periodic crash would turn people off to the system, and that might mean there would be a movement for a social change, a different system that wouldn't leave the capitalists at the top. So they had every interest to try to make the system less unstable. I used to say to my students, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago, right? So, but they never did. They could never do it, which is why we're in one now. They just never did it. That's the first. The second thing, every time we've had a major crash, it's easy to show what the trigger was. Let me give you an example. The last time we had a terrible viral pandemic in this country was back in 1918, roughly 100 years ago. It was called, in those days, the Spanish flu. It killed 700,000 Americans. Devastating. Why did it happen in 1918? Well, it had a trigger. The trigger was World War I, which went from 1914 to 1918. It exhausted people. It decimated economies. It made people have to do with less food than they were used to, with bad diets, with inadequate medical attention. So in a sense, the population was weakened and was vulnerable, and wham, the virus came. Well, now let's do today. We are a society that has a number of problems we should know about. We do not have a national health service. We do not have adequate health care for millions and millions of our people. It's a scandal. We're the only advanced country without a national universal health care system. So that weakens our population in terms of its physical well-being. We are also the worst country in the world for obesity. We medicate ourselves by eating too much and by eating crappy food that is produced by companies that want to make a profit, so they fill it with salt and fat and all the other things that we get too much of in our diets. You put all that together, and we were already uniquely vulnerable. We know all of this. Our biologists, our nutritionists, they know all of this. We understand it, but we didn't do anything about it. And that, I think, made us vulnerable to this virus. One more little fact before I give you the last part of the answer. The United States, and there's no way to get around this, we have 4.5% of the population of the world, but we have 25% of the COVID cases and the COVID deaths. We are a rich country, and that is a statement of failure beyond any words I could come up with, that a rich country with 4.5% of the people of this world accounts for 25% of the deaths and of the cases. Well, you know, here's how we could have prepared, which would have done the job. We could have said to the companies in this country that make masks and gloves and ventilators and hospital beds, you have to produce all of those things, and you have to store them in warehouses so that if and when the virus that we know will come, when it gets here, we are prepared. We didn't do that. The private companies, capitalist companies, they don't want to do that. And you know why? because that's their system. They do what's profitable. And guess what's not profitable? Produce millions of masks,
that aren't
stick them in
used.
a warehouse
Yeah.
where they gather dust and have to be cleaned and have to be monitored and have to be replaced. Wait for years until the next virus. No company's going to do that because it isn't profitable. That's a, ready, failure of capitalism to do what we need for public health. There's no other way to say it. Okay, then the government can come in. That's what the government's supposed to do. It should come in and say, well, private capitalism stinks at maintaining public health, so we'll do it. We will buy, we're the government, we will buy the masks, the gloves, the ventilators, all of it. We will store it around the country where people are, and we will maintain it, and we will monitor it, and we will have it available when the next virus hits. In the United States, where our politicians think that the private capitalist sector is where efficiency is and where we should rely on, our government didn't do what was necessary to compensate for the failure of private capitalism. By the way, the government knows exactly what I'm saying, because let me give you an example where the government does do what I tell people. It's the military. You know, it's not profitable to produce a gun or a tank or a missile or any of the things. And so private companies wouldn't do it unless they knew the government would buy it at a price that would generate a profit. So the government comes in and does it. It buys the missiles, it puts them in a warehouse, it maintains them, it protects them, it replaces them, it updates them. It does exactly what has to be done for a military emergency, but it didn't do what it needs to have done for a health emergency, and so it failed to take care of the problem. You know, we know it's a failure because other countries did it. Other companies made their capitalists produce those goods, or the government stepped in. I'm talking New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, Europe, most European countries too. I mean, the failure here is staggering. The only thing more overwhelming than the failure of the United States is the capacity of the president of this country to refer to what happened as we're doing great. We're doing such a fine job. You really have to take your hat off, because my goodness, it's the ultimate in make-believe. So I want to explain to people, we don't have to be suffering like this. We could be in the position of other countries. You know how many people have died in New Zealand from COVID? 8. We have
7 in Taiwan.
That's right. And we have 200,000, I believe we crossed today.
We crossed it.
200,000 dead people. I mean, you are killing this country because of an economic system that wasn't prepared and that has been unable to contain this virus. These are failures of the system. You can't blame this on the virus. Other countries did it way better than we did. And the book is there to show you that the sickness we most have to deal with is the system that failed and not the virus that came again. You know, in recent years, we've had the SARS virus, the MERS virus, the Ebola virus. We know that the viruses come, they're part of nature. We have to be prepared. There is no excuse, given what we know, for the lack of preparedness, unless you understand that our kind of economic system is crippled in that regard and is so afraid of giving the government the power to compensate for their broken down incapacity that they won't let the government do it. And then the result, we die and we are sick.
You know, that is what is interesting, Dr. Wolff, is that I think you're correct that I think it's definitely by design. We could take a look at Donald Trump early in the pandemic, and I'm not even talking about whether he knew it or not, but holding back from things that the WHO had ready that America could use, but because they wanted companies, their cronies, to take over things like the ventilators that were supposed to be built at $3,000 a piece that were instead built at $25,000 to $50,000 a piece, and we can go from item to item that shows. We actually, by making healthcare a product, by making a sickness a product, or something that is to be solved by a product, what we've done is we've turned everything into saying we have to let our markets handle this, as opposed to what humanity would normally do: get it done. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're going to see it now play out with this vaccine business.
Oh,
We're having
yes.
companies, we're allowing companies to compete. In other words, to make an effort to be profitable, you want to be the first one out there. So where you cut corners, getting it done quickly, because that's where the profit is. So you cut the corners on testing it, and you cut the corners on safety, and you cut the corner. I mean, we have this over and over and over. This last week, there was a decision in New York State to prosecute, to go after Johnson & Johnson. Why? Because they misled people about the opioids that they produce. You know, since 1997, according to the Centers for Disease Control, over 400,000 people basically died from overdoses of these opioids, which were not explained to people how deadly they were, how addictive they were, the whole story. We have example after example. The cigarette companies that killed unknown numbers of Americans, the health hazard, we let that be shortchanged. We allow companies to produce foods that are cheap and available, that are terrible for your body, that do you harm. We allow private profit to govern our medical care system. And now these chickens are coming home to roost, and we're suffering horrifically from it.
Interestingly, you brought up the issue about the vaccine earlier. One of the things I don't know how many Americans know quite yet, I'm pretty sure you do, is that Congress, one of the bills that McConnell wants to put through Congress is something to indemnify companies in the event that they are sued for any missteps having to do with COVID. And I'm pretty darn sure vaccines would fall under that, which means, okay, so we don't test fully, because if somehow somebody gets some sort of sickness, we'll be indemnified by the government.
That's right. In fact, what Mr. McConnell did, and what is typical for the Republican Trump era now, is he basically said to the Democrats, we will not give another extension of the stimulus, the help that we give to the tens of millions of unemployed people in this country, the tens of millions of people affected in one way, directly or indirectly, with a lost job or lost income. We won't do it unless you, the Democrats, give us this indemnification, this relieving of business of any responsibility. Look, this country has not mandated for businesses to take the steps that are necessary to keep us safe. When President Trump ordered the meatpacking workers last summer to go back to work, he demanded that they go back to work. He did not demand anything like a set of cleanliness measures that their employers would have to install. The employers don't want to have to do it because it cuts into their profits.
Yeah.
And the same situation is going on now. They don't want the employers not only to have to keep the place clean and neat, but then to give them an added incentive to not spend any money on taking care of the COVID risk by saying to them, no one can sue you no matter what happens, even if they can show that your failure to socially distance, or your failure to disinfect, or your failure to check the vaccine before you injected it into a human body produced the sickness, the illness, the death. I mean, it is a staggering accumulation of a system's dysfunction, the failure of a system led by people who do everything in their power to protect the rich and powerful from the consequences of the very system that is failing.
Now, Dr. Wolff, here's an issue. And right now, one of the great things about your book is you took this collection of essays that enumerates all these failures, all these illnesses, if you will, along with, so what's the possibilities? How do we get mass penetration? Because when somebody reads your stuff, they get it. The problem is getting a sufficient quantity of Americans to read this stuff, absorb this stuff, and not fall for an indoctrination of a failed system. How do we skin the cat differently so that we have better penetration?
Well, I think it's a slow slog, and I share your frustration. I wish we could do it better, bigger, faster. But I have to say, and I don't mean this to flatter you, programs like yours, networks like Pacifica, all of us on the podcast universe around this country, we are getting there. People are turned off by the mainstream media. They know how manipulated it is. It's not just the overwhelming partisanship of Fox News and all of that, nor is it, CNBC or CNN. They leave out much of the profound problems of this society. And I think, really, and I haven't said this before in my life, more and more people get that. They know that the things are falling apart. They feel it, they see it, they sense it, and they don't get from the media what they need to understand it. That's our job. That's what the book was written for. That's what your programs try to do. And I think we just have to keep at it, noticing, as we do, that the people who go find us on YouTube and so on, it keeps growing steadily every week for most of us. And I think that's a sign of a shift in this country. Let me give it to you this way. It's a little different. A great political leader once responded to the frustration of those around him who said, nothing seems to be changing, nothing seems to be happening. And he said to them, like the wise fellow that he was, look, for decades, nothing seems to happen. And then in a few weeks, decades happen.
I like
That's
that.
how it, yeah, isn't it wonderful?
I love that.
It's building, and then suddenly, wow.
It happens.
And I think the American people, when they understand the magnitude of what has been done to them, what you referred to in the beginning, the last 40 years of rising productivity and stagnant wages, and how that made the rich richer and everybody else in difficulty, and why we now have all living under the umbrella of debt that we can barely carry. As people understand who benefited from all this, why it's possible that you can't afford to get your kids through college, and Jeffrey Bezos in the last 6 months went from $135 billion to 175. I mean, you will see a kind of rapid transformation in which people will then put together the bits and pieces all of us have put out there and begin to see the picture for what it is.
Dr. Wolff, I've been talking about the revolution will not be televised. And it's interesting because what I'm actually seeing is that's a stolen phrase, of course, but I morphed it into the depression will not be televised. Right now, we are in a depression. There are people starving. If you go out to San Antonio, Texas, Houston, Texas, several parts of New York, there are big parking lots with cars and a lot of food there ready to give these people. But it's not making a lot of news because the corporate class doesn't want people to realize how bad things are. So what I'm glad to see is, first of all, is we have books like yours, and like you said, there are many programs that are starting to put this out. I have folks that are working in Oregon right now that's showing the pictures of what's really going on, not only with fires but with people's lives. So I think this is so important, and I want to thank you for coming to the show and ask you your last words before we close out.
Well, I think it's crucial what you say. This word has to get out. These understandings have to get out. But look, there's a little bit of compassion I think we need to have for ourselves. We are living in the disintegration of the American capitalist empire. I didn't say this in the past. I'm not an alarmist, but I am now persuaded I don't see a way out. I don't see it. The Chinese economy has caught up to the United States and is about to surpass it. America waited too long and too late to figure that out. It can't deal with it. The separation from the Europeans, an act of rageful blaming others, is making the alliance incapable of holding itself together. You're seeing disintegration, not just in the United States with the fires and the hunger and the explosion of evictions that is literally around the corner, but globally. The United States is in a period of decline. And if we've learned anything from history, it's very hard to go through that. It's particularly difficult for the people in the declining empire to face up to it. Look, the British Empire is long over, and many people in Britain still can't get their minds around that reality. We're at an earlier stage, but that's what's happening. And we have to be cognizant, and this is a little scary, but I'll have to say it as my closer. We need to change out and get beyond capitalism, or else capitalism will take us down with it.
Dr. Richard D. Wolff, author of The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Thank you so kindly for having been once more on Politics Done Right.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Politics Done Right. It makes every bit as big a contribution as I try to make, and I am flattered to be part of it.
I'm Egberto Willies, host of Politics Done Right, an independent news program. I post several news videos of interest every day. I ask you so kindly to subscribe to my channel, and please leave me some comments. Thank you very much.